Hey there, YouTube. It's me, Broken Terrain, coming to you with another crafting video. This is the third part in my pirate ship series. I've got the sails and all the rigging done, and boy, it's looking fantastic. So, why don't you come along and we'll get started right after the drop. So, when I begin this part of the build, the most daunting aspect for me was the ratlines. The ratlines are those net-like shapes going up the sides of the masts. And those are so the sailors or pirates can climb to the top of the masts and fix and apply any kind of rigging changes that need to be made. So to do this, I created a stencil with a piece of paper and then transferred that stencil to some parchment paper. And the parchment paper is so I can glue right to the paper, and then a unique property of the parchment is to actually just release that glue. Nothing sticks to it. So I've transferred my stencils to the parchment paper, and I've cut some butcher twine to length. My wife found some butcher twine, and we both thought it would be perfect for the scale of the pirate ship, and it really works great. Looks good. So once I've transferred the design of the ratlines to the parchment paper, I go back and then glue the long runners to the parchment. And then using a large needle and more of the butcher's twine, I feed the thread through and knot it to each of the runner lines. And after I'm done knotting, I dab the knots with some super glue, and that's just to ensure that everything stays together and adds a bit more permanency to my rope and knot work. Once I finish each line of rigging, I then cut the thread and begin anew. Here you can see I've advanced time just a little bit. And I came up with a really good technique to help facilitate tying the knots in exactly the spot I wanted them on the rigging. I used that long silver poker, and when I position that exactly where I want the knot to be in between certain folds of the thread, I can pull it tight, and it will then tighten to where I have that poker, and that allows me to get the right size knots in the right places almost every time. It rarely failed. It's a fantastic technique. And if you're crazy enough to try this, I recommend it wholeheartedly. So I'm almost finished with this first of 6. You can see 3 stenciled on the parchment paper. This is just one side of the ratlines. This actually took some time to do, and I'm actually fast forwarding or playing at a higher speed. You're welcome. You would probably fall asleep if you watched me do these each individually at full time. That first done, it's on to the second. And like all projects, you learn, get better, get faster as it goes. And as you can see, I've got quite the technique down by the time I've reached the second one. As much of a pain in the butt these were, boy, it's worth it. As soon as you see these, your eye recognizes exactly what they're supposed to be, and the power they have on the look of the ship. The silhouette of the ship is just incredible. So even though doing 6 of these darn things was such a pain, ultimately it was worth it in the end. They look amazing. Once all the knot work was completed, I went back with some white PVA glue, hit a dab on all the knots, and then brushed it in just to strengthen the butcher's twine and lock everything into place. Now it's time to work on securing the rigging and how I'm going to go about that. On sailing ships and pirate ships, they have these pieces called blocks, or the block, and it's this small little pulley that helps to connect the rigging to the ship. To mimic the pulley or the block, I am going to use these wooden beads, and then I'm going to router a groove around the bead. And you see, while I'm doing that, I'm preparing some of the mast as well. Here we have a finished look of the ratline with a plank down the middle and the blocks on the edge. To get the plank, I grab a craft stick trimmed to size, and on the marks, I drill holes appropriate for the size of butcher twine. Then I feed all 4 of the ends through. In a real ship, all 4 ends would end in a block, and then all the blocks would be attached to the ship. But I am not a madman and was already regretting some of this work, so I decided to just have the outer 2 edges ending in blocks, and the middle 2 ends simply knotted to the plank. Again, this poker tool was invaluable during this project. There was just no way to get those knots to sit where I wanted them to without it. So if you are a glutton for punishment and want to try something similar on a project, do yourself a favor and get one of these little pointer tools. So here we see a close-up of one of my beads that I've turned into one of the blocks. And now I'm taking the end of one of the ratlines, gluing it to and inside the groove. Here I am gluing the other side. And then once affixed, I will twist and then glue the knot to make sure that the block stays where I want it to within the thread. A little more crazy glue or super glue. This particular brand was made by a gorilla. Here's the second block for this set of ratlines. And when all dried, trim the excess. And a little glue on the knot, just to be safe. Now it's time to create the second set of blocks that will attach to the ship. These were much easier, as I could just tie a knot around the bead and then wrap the 2 pieces and apply glue. I went through a ton of super glue on this project. Once both parts of the blocks are glued, it's time to tie them together. I start by feeding the butcher string through one of the beads and then through the other. And once connected, I do my best to tie a double knot. Very difficult at this small a scale trying to keep these two pieces together. But it can be done. Here's your proof. And once I get the two blocks the distance apart that I think looks good at this scale, I trim the ends, and then using the poker I poke the knot inside one of the beads to hide it, and then, you guessed it, more super glue. And here's the other set of blocks. Snip off those ends, tuck that knot inside, and more super glue. Fantastic. With that one done, I just need to do 5 more. That's right, there was a total of 6. So how I'm going to attach the rat lines to the masts is with a little florist's wire. That's that green wire ring you see there. I wrapped the wire around one of the masts for the proper size and shape. And now I'm going to glue the rat lines to it. My thought being that I could simply slip the ring with the 2 rat lines over the mast, and that toothpick I drilled and glued in earlier will hold them up at exactly the position I desire them to be. And it worked! My goodness. I tried a lot of new techniques, and I'm surprised at how often things worked. You know, you always get a few things that don't work, but I'm pretty pleased with all the new techniques I tried and how often things worked out. Well, I do love magnets, and it's time to use a few more. So this was a mistake, drilling the holes for the magnets in the foam, and later on I would just use an X-Acto to cut them out. But it works the same, just a little less clean. So I cut the grooves for the magnets out. You can see I used white glue in the first, but I quickly abandoned that. I forgot how much or how impatient I am. Bring on the hot glue. So once those magnets are hot glued in, and then covered with just a very thin sheet of hot glue to make sure those magnets stay in the foam where I want them, I then take the ends of the rat lines and tie them around a magnet on top of the magnet glued in, and then I super glue the rat lines down to that second magnet. And this is so I can maintain the ability to remove the masts and all the rigging and sails, so that me and my players can just use really the important bits, the ship itself, for any kind of encounter. Here we go, here's the other side. And I learned my lesson, no drill this time. Good old X-Acto knife. She'll never let you down. Little hot glue, stick the magnets in, and you can see they hold really well. A fun fact, the magnets on the rigging exhausted my supply, and I had to order new magnets. The new magnets I got are pretty slick. They're a little larger, but I'm sure you'll be seeing them in a project very soon. Once I have the rat lines glued to the magnets, I let dry so that I can move on to other aspects of the project. It's time to attach another set of ratlines. Here you can see me checking for position, because now that I've got one set up, I need the other two to match the position relative to the first set. I certainly don't want the blocks on one set hanging much lower or higher than the next. And here's a shot of all three. And now that all three are up, it's time to get working on the masts and the cross section that will actually hold up the sails. I've got it panned out here so that I can check height and distance, because at this point everything's eyeball. There is no real measurements. So I'm working with this top part. I believe it's called the yard arm. Could be mistaken, but this is the part that actually holds the sails. And I'm wrapping some of the butcher twine around so that I can then hang it from the mast. And that toothpick, where I put it, should keep the yard arm hanging exactly where I want on the mast. So once I've knotted it to two sides centered within the 6-inch yard, I drop some super glue down so those knots stay tight and stay in place. And then it's time to work on the spanker sail or gaff sail. So I remove the mizzen mast and pull two pieces of dowel to act as the gaff arms or the spanker sail arms. And the spanker sail or gaff sail looks a bit like a wedge or a little triangle on the back of the boat. And so once I've tied the first arm down and glued it into place, I will work on the second, positioning it appropriately higher than the first arm and at an interesting angle to create an interesting looking spanker sail. Again, once knotted and in place, super glue is applied to the butcher's twine and the doweling itself. Once those knots have been completed and the glue is dried, I'll take a piece of paper and stencil out how I want my spanker sail to look. And I'm going to add a little decoration, a little curve on the edges. And I'm just going to keep going back with that lined paper, making little measurements as I hold it up to the ship itself. And in this way, I can get good looking, well-sized sails for the size of the ship. This method really worked well. I didn't have to worry about the costs and limited availability of lined paper. We've got that stuff lying around the house everywhere. So I could cut and shape the sails to fit my vision. And here's a look of the paper sails in place. At this point in the build, my wife told me that the masts and the sails were way too short. And she dared me to go bigger. And go bigger I did. I decided that I would do a second set of sails to add a bit of height to the build. So I had an idea how I wanted to do that. I was going to create those little perches, better known as the crow's nest. And each mast has one in between the two sections, the lower and the upper. And some ships even go 3 sails, but I'm not that crazy. I'm just going to do 2. But in between the bottom mast and the top mast, I'm going to have these small platforms so that my sailors and pirates can climb around on the rigging and be up in the masts. This is going to add all kinds of fun, detail, and different tactics to any kind of encounter we might get. So with the diagram down on parchment, I glue the matchsticks into place, and then using this magnetic strip material I have, I'm going to lay these planks down along the wooden frame. It might look a little haphazard right now, but once dry, I'll go back in with those clippers and trim everything up to a nice looking shape. So that's my large one. I felt it needed a little more support, so I took one of my little square woodsies. I cut it down just a little bit more, and I glued it to the center. That way when I affix it to the top of the masts and then put a smaller mast on top, they'll be a bit more secure. Next I'm going to work on the smaller versions. So I'm going to leave the big one for the center mast. I'm going to do these small ones, and I'm just going to cut one of those pieces in half to get this. And you can see the magnetic strip adhering to the base of the figurine. So once I lay these into place, I'm going to work on the top masts. Instead of drilling a hole and gluing a toothpick through it like I did with the larger ones, I'm just going to attach a small piece of matchstick to the top of these. And once the magnetic strips were dry, I added some woodsies to the top of each one so that my wooden masts would be glued to wood instead of the magnetic material. This would help both strengthen and give them a more stable platform, and I think it looks a little better too, just a little more visual interest. So we're zoomed out on the ship now, and you can see I'm placing those down. I had originally wanted the big one for the crow's nest, but realized it was just way too big scale-wise, so I used it as the middle of the main mast, and I will use another small one for my crow's nest. And then eyeballing everything, I trimmed the top masts into the size I wanted. And now, and here I am affixing them to the little perches. You can see the 2 smaller ones and then the larger one for the center. Once this was completed, I realized that painting the fully assembled ship would be nigh impossible and a little bit stupid. So before I put the sails on, I took all the masts and rigging down and I applied my brown wash to the raw wood. I haven't done the painting step yet, and I'm assuming I'm going to keep these the way they are. I might brush another layer of brown wash on them, but I like the look, and trying to paint around the rigging and the sails themselves I think would be impossible. So they're just going to stay this nice brown color. The wash does a pretty good job of making these pieces look like real pirate ship masts and rig. Speaking of painting, if you've got a couple of colors you're interested in seeing put on the ship, please write a comment below about how you would like to see the ship painted for the next video, and I'll take into consideration anyone's comments. Thank you. And while I'm talking about it, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and share the video to your friends. And always leave a comment below. It helps with the YouTube algorithms. My wife found this wonderful cheesecloth material that she thought would work really well for the sails. It's got this really cool crosshatch pattern, and I thought it would look amazing, but it was much too white, and we decided to dye it with some tea. So I've boiled myself a nice Ziploc of tea, and now I'm just going to dunk the entire piece of cloth into it. And I'm going to let that soak for some time so I get a nice brown tan color to it. And I'll put that up to dry for several days. Once dried, I'll take the cheesecloth out, back to my table, unwrap it, and lay my stencils down. Here you see me cutting out the spanker sail from the template. This proved pretty difficult. This cheesecloth was hard to work with. One layer was too thin, so the sails are actually multiple layers of cheesecloth. And I'm sure anyone who regularly works with cloth, seamstress or whatnot, dressmaker, is probably pretty mad at me right there. I'm thinking you normally pin the pattern down to the fabric, but I didn't. Once the shape's trimmed, I go in along the edges with some white PVA glue, spread that out, and let dry. And this is to keep the fabric from unraveling along the edges, and it's also going to allow me to go back in with some scissors and trim off a nice, clean, sharp edge. If you're going to use the cheesecloth, and you probably should because it really does create a great texture, this step is vital. And here you can see it, the nice sharp edges after the glue and the trim. Here's a look at some of the other sails in the process of drying. So once done, I'm going to attach the spanker sail or the gaff sail to the gaff arms. I'm going to do that by needling through the corners of the sail and then knotting it down along the mast there. And I did this for all of them, all 6 sails, the spanker sail. And you're getting a good look at the first set of sails there. And now that I've gotten this far, I can actually attach the upper sails to my masts. Here they are. It's a good look at how the ship looks. But we're not finished yet. Time to attach those top sails to the lower ones. Again, I just thread the butcher string around the corners of the sails. And the way the upper sails are, they tie to and attach to the yard of the lower sails. So I attach and knot and then hit those knots with super glue, and that small little length I left out, I also apply super glue to stiffen. And this is going to help give the effect that those top sails are actually catching some breeze. So with one side done, I move to the other. And using the pin really helps. With the knots tied, I apply more super glue. Don't want those knots coming undone. And now to attach the lower sails. And I had to give this some thought, but I think I'm going to utilize those magnets. But as I mentioned before, I ran out of magnets. So what I'm actually going to do is use some of that floral wire. So once I've tied the butcher string to the corners of the sails, I'm going to pull my wire out. See how it's affected by the magnet? I'm going to measure out where I want that sail to end. And then I'm going to cut that florist wire to size. And then I'm going to cut a second piece because you've got to do the same to both sides. Using a small pair of tweezers, I'm just going to round one side off so that better connects to the magnet. And then I'm going to glue the butcher's twine, or that thread coming from the sail, directly to the floral wire. This was very difficult to do. There was probably a better method for connecting the sails to the ship, but this is what I came up with, and it worked fairly well. It does give the sails a bit of rigidity, and it does make them look like they're catching somewhat of a breeze. If I have one complaint, it's that my sails look a little deflated. That might be my only complaint. I wish they looked a bit more full of wind, but that's okay. With all sails connected, it's time to do the jib sail, which is that little triangle sail on the front. Just like the others, I make a paper template, trace down on the cheesecloth, cutting very carefully. Once the sail has been cut out, I'm going to take it to my parchment paper, glue the edges, and trim clean. This was a very effective method for dealing with the cheesecloth sails. I'm going to knot it to the mast first, and I messed with the height a little bit. This was a little harder to do. I couldn't use my little poker method up here on the mast, but eventually I got it to work. And once I knew where it sat on the mast, I could go in and attach it to the jib mast here. And I had a little bit of play with the jib sitting in the straw. It was a little loose, but I found the angle I liked. The bottom was a little off, so because of that glue, I was able to trim it and maintain a nice strong shape. Once trimmed up, I added a knot, knotted it to the sail, and then knotted it to the jib mast. Again, a little super glue to hold those knots into place, and then also to hold their position on the mast. And there you go. The rigging and sails are complete. Now, the gluing the twine along those floral metal arms, it worked, but boy oh boy, it was precarious. It's hard to glue thread along wire like that. Well, I came up with a method. I just went back in and I knotted along the length of the wire, and I did this for all of them. And finally, I put the crow's nest on the top, and we're just about finished.
Aye, wait a minute, Mr. Broken Terrain. You're missing a most important part of me ship, the steering wheel.
Oh, that's right, Captain. Sorry about that. Let's put a steering wheel together. I'm going to start with a base. I'm going to do 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. This is going to be large enough for the figurine, but a little larger to add visual interest to the steering wheel of the ship. And just like you've seen me do so many times before, I'm going to go in and score the boards, widen the gaps with a pen, draw the wood grain, hit it with the wire brush. And then using the captain figurine, I'm going to make sure I get the height of the steering wheel just right. Looking good. A few more trims. And once I like it, I'm going to grab a little piece of foam. This piece here is a 1 inch by 1 inch square, and I'm going to mark the corners out also at 1 inch and trim them up. In this way, I won't be doing a perfect circle, but I'll be doing an octagon, and at this scale, it's pretty close. I'll draw the center, cut the center out, and I'll have the basic wheel shape. And unfortunately, I didn't catch the rest on camera, but I end up poking toothpicks through the sides and have them meet in the center. And I'll cap that off with a little pushpin brad to make it look like the spokes of the steering wheel. And then I'll go back in and I'll finish the piece that will actually hold the wheel, softening up the edges, drawing out my wood grain, hitting things with the brass brush for the texture. And when I put it up next to the captain, it was a little close, so I'm going to cut in on the side and let it overhang just a little bit. This was a good decision, and the captain sits on the base well. And then I'm going to take that steering wheel, and now that the toothpicks have dried, I'm going to go around and clip the edges off and attach. Once attached, I'm going to go back in with my little spike and poke lots of little nail holes just to add a little realism and texture to this piece. It's already going to be visually striking, and I just wanted to improve the look. And then I'll glue it to the back of the ship and put the captain on for fit. What do you think, Captain?
Arr, me likes. I can't wait to take my ship out to the open sea.
Fantastic. So there we go. Part 3 all done. Let's take a look at some of the details and aspects of the ship. You see the captain and crew hanging on the rigging, the blocks holding down our ratlines, the jib sail up front, the spanker sail in back. I am so pleased with this build. It took a long time, and at times it was very frustrating, but it was all worth it. And those magnetic bases for those crow's nests were a great idea, and now I can have figurines fighting and dancing around in the riggings. Looking forward to pulling the ship out for my players, and I want to thank you for spending the time watching this video. Until next time, have a great day and craft on.